Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm Jennifer, and you are listening to the Ego Next Door podcast. Today, we're going to talk about highly sensitive people, empathy, sympathy, and the nuanced differences between them. We're also going to touch on a topic that is very close to my heart, the often misunderstood borderline personality disorder. I want to start by making it clear that this episode is not intended to discredit other professionals. Instead, it aims to provide an alternative perspective on what is often seen and categorized as problematic behavior carried by those who are deemed dangerous or reckless. If you have heard of BPD, borderline personality disorder, certain traits may immediately come to mind. Impulsive behavior, narcissism, selfishness. Some even lump it together with narcissistic personality disorder, portraying it as part of the infamous dark triad, which actually includes Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. For those who aren't familiar, the dark triad refers to a set of 3 antisocial personality traits that are often considered malevolent, or in pop culture as the core of evil. But as I have emphasized in previous episodes, we are not here to diagnose anyone. Discussing narcissism, for instance, should be about recognizing personality traits and not about assigning a full diagnosis. This distinction is crucial, especially since many individuals diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder may have been misdiagnosed. Several studies suggest that those diagnosed with NPD may actually struggle with borderline personality disorder, or CPTSD instead, displaying traits known as narcissistic fleas, behaviors adopted by victims of narcissistic individuals. For more on this, check out episode 8 of the Ego Next Door podcast. So again, we are here to talk about intense emotions and the struggle to regulate them. While increased sensitivity is frequently manifested in our emotional responses and relationships with others, it also plays an important role in how we perceive and navigate the world through intuitive knowledge. This ability to detect tiny emotional clues frequently coincides with the concept of intuition, a deeper, sometimes subconscious knowledge that directs our actions and reactions. To understand the relationship between high sensitivity and intuition, we must look at how these traits interact and impact one another in our daily lives. It has long been assumed that highly sensitive people, those who feel emotions intensely, are naturally attuned to others. But could this heightened sensitivity be connected to trauma? If you have endured a difficult or abusive upbringing, you likely know how critical it is to gauge other people's emotions and predict their behaviors. This is a common protective mechanism. But unlike healthy emotional attunement, what highly sensitive people often experience is more than a simple awareness or responsiveness to other people's emotions. What we experience can often become an overbearing sense of weight that controls one's abilities to prioritize our own needs. But what does science say about intuition? While the definition and explanation of intuition remain unclear, one thing is certain. It is more than a vague, mystical gut feeling. Intuition has been studied for decades and has been scientifically linked to phenomena such as telepathy, precognition, presentiments, and remote viewing. Some in the psychology field believe that intuition is simply common sense. However, researchers like Fishbein call for a distinction, describing intuition as a cognitive process that produces immediate and often subconscious insights, while common sense involves practical reasoning based on cultural norms and everyday experiences. While intuition can be defined in many ways, such as direct or immediate knowing or pure untaught knowledge, I will share Bernstein's definition, which is one of my favorites. the appearance in the mind of accurate information about the external world, which can be shown to have come not through the five senses, nor through a rearrangement of stored memory contents. It's important to note that our understanding of intuition remains open to interpretation and incorporates a plethora of overlapping terminologies. We will explore these in future episodes, but for now, I will share the names of a few to show you how deep this goes. Cognitive intuition, emotional intuition, creative intuition, instinctual intuition, spiritual intuition, somatic intuition, moral intuition, social intuition, expert intuition, temporal intuition, inferential intuition, and finally, holistic intuition. Moreover, some researchers propose a simple distinction between two types of intuition: intuitive judgment and intuitive insight. But more on that another time. As we can see, intuition has its place in how we navigate the world. But when our alarms are so easily triggered, it can be extremely difficult to distinguish intuitive thoughts from those rooted in fear. Research shows that our gut is closely connected to our brain through a complex network of nerves, impacting our emotional and mental state. This highlights the importance of differentiating true intuition from anxiety driven by trauma. Intuition is often described as a warm, fleeting sense of knowing, whereas anxiety rooted in trauma feels unsettling and is accompanied by hyper-focused thoughts that spiral into worst-case scenarios. From a scientific perspective, researchers like Bowlby, Ainsworth, and Judith Herman argue that heightened emotional attunement may indeed stem from childhood trauma. Growing up in such an environment can force us to constantly read the room, anticipate reactions, and adjust our behaviors to avoid negative outcomes. This vigilant state becomes ingrained, shaping how we interact with the world long after the threat has passed. Now, when we talk about highly sensitive individuals, it's essential to understand that their ability to empathize and read emotional cues can appear almost like a superpower. But behind this skill often lies a story of needing to grow up too fast in order to survive. For instance, as children, we might not have the option to run from danger or fight back. Instead, we learn to observe and interpret subtle signs in our surroundings to remain safe. This creates a deep-rooted habit of being highly observant and aware of others' feelings and potential reactions, which can seem like a positive trait, but is a reflection of a past that required hypervigilance for danger and threats. One of the most challenging aspects of this heightened sensitivity is that it's difficult to turn it off. Once it's deep-rooted, it becomes exhausting to exist in social settings where your brain is on constant alert, trying to interpret emotions and predict potential outcomes. Although you may no longer be in an emotional dangerous situation, your brain doesn't differentiate between the past and the present. This is because, on a neuropsychological level, our brains don't keep track of time in the same way our bodies do. We can be physically present, but mentally, we are scanning for threats just as we did in the past. All in all, when deeply traumatized, the part of our brain that processes emotion, the amygdala, influences the way the hippocampus functions, which is responsible for forming new memories and recalling past experiences. When trauma occurs, the brain may create new neural connections that affect the way the entire system functions. This hyper-awareness can lead to what some people call out-tuition. Unlike intuition, which is an internal sense of knowing, out-tuition is an externally oriented skill that involves being acutely aware of others' emotional states. The term out-tuition was introduced to me by Fleur Lusink, who explained that this heightened awareness of others can sometimes block our gut feelings and override our intuition. This concept may also resonate with you, especially if you are a childhood trauma survivor. Highly sensitive people become so adept at understanding other people's feelings that we lose touch with our own, building a barrier between what we feel and what we think we should feel. Have you ever been told that you are great at giving advice but terrible at taking your own? This may be because out-tuition overpowers your internal guidance system. The scientific explanation for this lies in the idea of increased sensitivity due to trauma. As an adult, you may have noticed yourself becoming extremely aware and overwhelmed by people's small emotional cues and vigilant to people's intentions. Needless to say that this type of reaction can make it even more difficult to develop genuine connections with people because in the midst of hypervigilance and overly cautious socialization, a wall of defense stands tall. As we look into intuition, we must recognize how it complements and contrasts with our ability to empathize and sympathize, two other critical components in understanding human emotion complexity. Our ability to intuitively detect the emotions of others frequently influences how we interact with them. But we must distinguish between empathy, compassion, and the tiny line that separates them. Understanding these differences can illuminate how highly sensitive people may struggle to balance emotional attunement to others with their own well-being. Empathy involves a deep understanding and involvement towards someone's pain, while sympathy involves a feeling of sorrow or pity when witnessing someone else's pain. Both are essential to keep a healthy mind and live in harmony with others, and more importantly, with yourself. It is possible to have empathy without sympathy, and it is also possible to have sympathy without empathy. Highly sensitive people have difficulty applying sympathy only to situations, where often distancing oneself from a situation is needed to keep one's sanity and observe a situation with more rationality and less emotional investment. The lines are blurred, transforming what could have been a simple relationship between two people into a burden, resulting in burnout, tiredness, and weakened boundaries. This gets even more problematic when we notice that it is so easy for highly sensitive people to have empathy for others and yet struggle with having empathy for oneself. The inability to be compassionate to oneself is a pathway to self-destruction. This is mostly due to the constant harsh self-criticism and holding oneself to incredibly high standards with no wiggle room to simply breathe and exist. But if struggling with high sensitivity, how can one take matters into their own hands and certify that relationships and livelihood will not be sabotaged due to lack of boundaries and emotional exhaustion triggered by feeling too much? The interplay between empathy and sympathy is especially important for highly sensitive people, whose heightened awareness makes it difficult to separate their own emotional from those of others. For highly sensitive people, the burden of feeling too much may turn empathy into fatigue, which is why self-compassion and boundaries are so important. This battle is especially intense in those suffering from borderline personality disorder, where high emotional responses and relational difficulties are aggravated by a lack of internal empathy. But not all is bad. Mainstream society often shames and misunderstands high sensitivity and prizes stoicism and emotional restraint. And while being sensitive is often seen as a sign of weakness, in reality, sensitivity is often a survival tactic developed to cope with past adversity in ages where someone should have been allowed to simply live and develop without having to rush into older life stages. In fact, being a highly sensitive person is often the struggle of those diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, who, unlike common misconceptions, struggle with relationships not due to a self-serving, self-centered nature, but due to heightened emotional responses. In my own journey, I found myself obsessed with getting a diagnosis. I wanted answers and pressed my therapist, asking, "What do I have? Who am I?" It felt like if I could name what I was experiencing, it would help me make sense of it all. But my therapist's response changed everything. A diagnosis should guide treatment, not define who you are. You are so much more than a label. At first, I thought this was just a cliche, a way for my therapist to avoid the work of naming my condition. But over time, I realized that clinging to a diagnosis can be limiting. When I was eventually diagnosed with BPD by a psychiatrist, it felt like an endpoint rather than a starting point for understanding myself. The psychiatrist overlooked the triggers and daily emotional struggles I faced that were clearly linked to trauma. This reliance on diagnostic oversimplification and ignoring comorbidities and trauma-informed care led him to prescribe me a cocktail of medications, which, of course, worsened my symptoms. This experience taught me that treatment should be as individualized as the people seeking it. More than labels and diagnosis, therapists should be trauma-informed and more focused on working towards healing than categorizing and attempting to fit clients into a predefined mold. Just as medication works differently for different people, so too should therapy and diagnosis be tailored. A label can offer guidance, but it should not be a cage that defines you. Recovery and healing come from understanding patterns, recognizing triggers, and nurturing compassion for oneself. Diagnosis alone does not lead to healing. The effort you put into therapy and your willingness to grow do. So, if you find yourself dealing with intense emotions or behaviors that align with a specific disorder, be kind to yourself. Do not become overly attached to a diagnosis. Instead, focus on finding a therapeutic process that addresses your experiences and helps you become more attuned to yourself. Remember, you are not just a list of symptoms or a label. You are a person deserving of understanding, connection, and a fulfilling life. Healing is about more than survival. It's about finding moments of joy, building a deeper relationship with yourself, and learning to live in harmony with others. You are more than PTSD, OCD, BPD, or any other set of letters. You are a human being, complex and valuable. So let's focus on living, healing, and embracing all that we are beyond the labels. On the next episode, we will look at apology. We will explore the hidden truths behind feelings of regret and the act of apologizing. Apologizing is more complex than it seems, and sometimes receiving an apology is not the ultimate solution. Finally, we will also discuss the potential for redemption. Thank you for listening to the Ego Next Door podcast. See you soon, and I hope you have a wonderful day. If you enjoyed today's episode and would like to hear more, don't forget to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel at Ego Next Door. And if you would like to support my work, consider becoming a patron to my Patreon creator page at Jennifer Hachia. The Ego Next Door podcast is presented solely for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The content here is not intended to serve as a substitute for the consultation, diagnosis, or medical treatment of a qualified healthcare provider. Reliance on any information provided here is at your own risk. If you or someone you know is in crisis or experiencing suicidal thoughts, please reach out immediately to someone who can help right away. Call your national emergency services or go to the nearest hospital.